The topic today is terrorism and shared psychosis with the former president, Donald Trump, and what we can do about it. And so the first thing I want to do is read to you a short letter to the editor that was written by Dr. Edward Edinger shortly after the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. And here's what he wrote. The letter was entitled "The Psychology of Terrorism." Terrorism is a manifestation of the psyche. It is time we recognize that the psyche as an autonomous factor in world affairs. The psychological root of terrorism is a fanatical resentment, a quasi-psychotic hatred originating in the depths of the archetypal psyche and therefore carried by religious archetypal energies. A classic literary example is Melville's Moby Dick. Captain Ahab, with his fanatical hatred of the white whale, is a paradigm of the modern terrorist. Articulate terrorists generally express themselves in religious, that is, archetypal terminology. The enemy is seen as the principle of objective evil, the devil, and the terrorist perceives himself as the heroic agent of divine or objective justice, God. This is an archetypal inflation of demonic proportions, which temporarily grants the individual almost superhuman energy and effectiveness. To deal with terrorism effectively, we must understand it. We need a new category to understand this new phenomenon. These individuals are not criminals and are not madmen, although they have some qualities of both. Let's call them zealots. Zealots are possessed by transpersonal archetypal dynamisms deriving from the collective unconscious. Their goal is a collective, not a personal one. The criminal seeks his own personal gain, not so the zealot. In the name of a transpersonal collective value, a religion, an ethnic or national identity, a patriotic vision, etc., they sacrifice their personal life in the service of their God. Although idiosyncratic and perverse, this is fundamentally a religious phenomenon that derives from the archetypal collective unconscious. Sadly, the much needed knowledge of this level of the psyche is not generally available. For those interested in seeking it, I recommend a serious study of the psychology of C.G. Jung. Now, sadly, and I was reading from this book, Archetype of the Apocalypse by Edward F. Edinger, and sadly, as a sign of the times, this letter was not published. Instead, the nation was deluged with mere descriptions of the horror, along with biographies of the suspects, with hardly a line of print or moment of television dedicated to understanding what had happened. The governor of Oklahoma would say at a memorial service, "We can't understand why it happened." Billy Graham, Baptist chaplain to the nation, had already confessed on national television before a crowd of weeping survivors that he did not know why God allows things like this to happen. Nobody seems to know what is going on, yet Edinger's book bravely tells us. So that's from the editor's preface of this book, Archetype of the Apocalypse. Now, this time around, we do have a little more sensible commentary on the issue. Very little, but at least something we could look at. Now, just want to see if I can reduce this screen. Why is this? No, didn't do it. Sorry. Okay, sorry. All right. So what I'm going to talk about today is an article that appeared in Scientific American on the 11th of January, and it's an article by one of their reporters, Tanya Lewis, and she was interviewing Dr. Bandy Lee, who is a professor of psychiatry at Yale University, and she is an expert on violence in maximum security prisons and places like that. And so Dr. Lee has become quite an interesting person over the last 4 years, because she has been saying since the beginning of the Trump presidency that he was not fit to be president for psychiatric reasons. And she was constantly violating a sort of a dictum of the American Psychiatric Association, which is called the Goldwater Rule, which says that psychiatrists should not diagnose public figures, that they should instead insist on examining someone before they talk about their mental health. And this is very irritating. And so, but Dr. Lee is very highly respected in some circles, and she makes a lot of sense to me. And this is a very powerful article, this interview that Tanya Lewis did with Dr. Lee. And so what I'm going to do is read the questions that Dr. Lee, that Ms. Lewis asked Dr. Lee, and then give her answers, and we can discuss them on the chat if you wish. Okay, so Dr. Lee is the author. She was the editor and organizer of a compilation of essays early in the Trump presidency called "The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump: 27 Psychiatrists and Mental Health Experts Assess a President." And then last summer, she wrote another book entitled "Profile of a Nation: Trump's Mind, America's Soul, a Psychological Assessment of the President against the backdrop of his supporters and the country as a whole." Now, I intend to invite Dr. Lee to come speak to us in our Wisdom Path colloquia sometime soon. But this will be, which will give the Wisdom Path colloquia the ability to ask her some questions directly. But in the meantime, I'm going to ask these questions and read her answers. And then if you have comments, you can put them in the YouTube chat. Okay, so this is Tanya Lewis interviewing Dr. Bandy Lee, who is a psychiatrist at Yale. First question: what attracts people to Trump? What is their animus or driving force? Answer: the reasons are multiple and varied, but in my recent public service book, Profile of a Nation, I have outlined two major emotional drives: narcissistic symbiosis and shared psychosis. Narcissistic symbiosis refers to the developmental wounds that make the leader-follower relationship magnetically attractive. The leader hungry for adulation to compensate for an inner lack of worth, projects grandiose omnipotence, while the followers, rendered needy by society's stressed or developmental issues, by societal stress or developmental issues, yearn for a parental figure. When such wounded individuals are given positions of power, they arouse similar pathology in the population that creates a lock and key relationship. So here we're talking about narcissistic symbiosis, and what I knew for some years now, because I was very close with a president of the Maryland Psychological Association, was that Donald Trump has very little ego in his deep unconscious, very, very small. And as a result of that, he needs to compensate for that. And so that's why he went around the country for the last 4 years having these big rallies, because he had people cheering him on and waving him on, and music playing, all that stuff. And so that made him feel better about himself and his ego. And so that's how he drew people into himself. And then the other point here is shared psychosis, which is also called madness of millions, when occurring at a national level or induced delusions, refers to the infectiousness of severe symptoms that goes beyond ordinary group psychology. When a highly symptomatic individual is placed in an influential position, the person's symptoms can spread through the population through emotional bonds, heightening existing pathologies and inducing delusions, paranoia, and propensity for violence, even in previously healthy individuals. The treatment is removal of exposure. So what Dr. Lee is saying here is that the only cure for this is going to be removal of exposure to Donald Trump. And of course, that's happening right now and probably through the month of February, because he's in the middle of an impeachment trial and he won't want to say anything that will get Republicans to vote against him at his impeachment trial. But he is, but after that, he can be a problem. And I just mentioned one dictum that Dr. Jung had, which was a group of 100 admirable people makes one blockhead. That's a famous quote of C.G. Jung. And what does that mean? Well, it means that if you have a group, and we have several people watching on YouTube right now, if I'm doing the talking and you're doing the listening, you're just focusing on what I'm saying, but you aren't really judging what I say per se. You're just saying, oh, that's what she says. Oh, I see. And so you leave aside your critical factor and you're just trying to understand what Dr. Lee said. And therefore, as long as you accept that, then I can guide you over a cliff eventually. And so that happens with any leader, of course, to a certain extent. But you need to keep your own functionality and your own ability to keep your own opinions and not rely solely on me. I mean, I'm not a mental health professional, and I never claim to be. So you can't rely on me for mental health advice. But you know, a lot of people still want to hear what I have to say for whatever reason, and so that's you know, that causes a leadership issue, which now I've got 13,000 followers on this YouTube channel, just about. I'm just under that now. And so that means a lot of people will hear what is being said here. But you have to apply your own judgment to whether what I say makes sense or not. That's essential. And so anyway, if you have 100 people and everybody's going along, or everybody's yelling and screaming like at a Trump rally, then that makes him authoritative, and you have the sense that he's authoritative, whether he is or not. He could be saying Mary has a little lamb, but if you don't make your own judgment about it, it could be not good. And this is what we almost had happen at the Capitol on the 6th of January. And so the way to treat this collective epidemic, this psychic epidemic, is to the way to treat the psychic epidemic is just remove the agent who's doing the leading. And so, all right, so that's one thing to think about. Good morning, Gary, and welcome. Talking about an article which appeared in the January 11th issue of Scientific American, and the article is by Tanya Lewis, and she's doing an interview with Dr. Bandy Lee, who is a psychiatrist at Yale, talking about Donald Trump and what to do about his followers now. So, next point. And so feel free to ask any questions or comment. I have a little complication on my screen, which I haven't been able to fix. Let's see. Just let's see if I can. All right. So anyway, if you want to ask a question in the chat, or speak up and ask a question or make a comment, please feel free to do so. Okay, next question. Why does Trump himself seem to gravitate toward violence and destruction? Okay, just here's what Dr. Lee says. Destructiveness is a core characteristic of mental pathology, whether directed toward the self or others. First, I wish to clarify that those with mental illness are, as a group, no more dangerous than those without mental illness. When mental pathology is accompanied by criminal mindedness, however, the combination can make individuals far more dangerous than either alone. Then she goes on. In my textbook on violence, I emphasize the symbolic nature of violence and how it is a life impulse gone awry, gone astray. Briefly, if one cannot have love, one resorts to respect. And when respect is unavailable, one resorts to fear. Trump is now living through an intolerable loss of respect, rejection by a nation in his election defeat. Violence helps compensate for feelings of powerlessness, inadequacy, and lack of real productivity. So basically, what Dr. Lee is saying here is that the violence that the president pumped up on January the 6th was a way to compensate for his feelings of powerlessness, inadequacy, and lack of real productivity. So he went around the country for 4 years golfing and giving big rallies, which pumped him up. But the truth is, he really didn't accomplish that much as president. And it would have been much more dangerous if he had been reelected, certainly. But okay, next question. Do you think Trump is truly exhibiting delusional or psychotic behavior, or is he simply behaving like an autocrat, making a bald-faced attempt to hold on to his power? Okay, so Dr. Lee says she thinks it's both. He's both delusional and psychotic, and he's behaving like an autocrat. So here's how she answers it. I believe it is both. He is certainly of an autocratic disposition because his extreme narcissism does not allow for equality with other human beings, as democracy requires. Psychiatrists generally assess delusions through personal examination, but there is other evidence of their likelihood. First, delusions are more infectious than strategic lies, and so we see from the sheer spread that Trump likely truly believes them. Okay, so he believes his own delusions. Two, his emotional fragility manifested in extreme intolerance of realities that do not fit his wishful view of the world and predispose him to psychotic spirals. Okay, and third, his public record includes numerous hours of interviews and interactions with other people, such as the hour-long one with the Georgia Secretary of State. That very nearly confirms delusion, as my colleague and I discovered in a systematic analysis. So they did a systematic analysis, and if you find Dr. Bandy Lee's interview on Scientific American, you can find the link to this systematic analysis. So the article in Scientific American is called The Shared Psychosis of Donald Trump and His Loyalists. So Jordan, I'm doing an analysis today of an article by Dr. Bandy Lee of Yale on Trump and his followers and what to do about it afterwards.
Excellent. Yeah, I just caught the tail end of that when I hopped on in the room.
Right. And so I've already answered a couple of questions here, and you're welcome to jump in. So the next question that is asked is, where does the hatred some of his supporters display come from, and what can be done to promote healing? Okay, so here's what Dr. Lee says. In Profile of a Nation, I outline the many causes that create his followership, but there is important psychological injury that arises from relative, not absolute, socioeconomic deprivation. Yes, there is a great injury, anger, and redirectable energy for hatred, which Trump harnessed and stoked for his manipulation and use. The emotional bonds he has created facilitate shared psychosis at a massive scale. It is a natural consequence of the conditions we have set up. For healing, I usually recommend 3 steps. 1, removal of the offending agent, the influential person with severe symptoms. 2, dismantling systems of thought control common in advertising, but now also heavily adopted in politics. And 3, fixing the socioeconomic conditions that give rise to poor collective mental health in the first place. Now, this is important because at the beginning, I read Dr. Edinger's definition of the psychology of terrorism. And what he said at the beginning of his definition was it's rooted in a fanatical resentment. And I certainly believe that there's lots of resentment, especially among American men, and especially in the red states, because and they have good reason to be resentful, because among other things, the politicians supported corporations by allowing them to move a lot of jobs offshore, particularly in the automotive industry. So in the Rust Belt, for example, thousands of very high-paying jobs were moved to China, and they didn't replace them. And when they don't replace them, that certainly is a just cause for resentment. That's one. And secondly, the people that are resentful like that don't understand that it's not the Democrats that are at issue here. It's actually Wall Street and the corporate enterprise, investment bankers and that sort of people who have just not cared about people in lower echelons in society. And so what they've done is they've, over the last several years, pulled all the value of the country to themselves in the economy. And as they've done that, and they do it in insidious ways. So, for example, in the Great Recession in 2008, the investment banks got themselves paid double on all defaulted mortgages. Now, how did they do that? They did that by, first of all, creating this terrible emergency. And so the Secretary of the Treasury and President Bush just threw, $450 billion at the problem to prevent AIG and others from going bankrupt. And what that had the effect of doing was paying off all the mortgages. All the mortgages were paid. There was no damage to the banks or to the insurance company. The trouble is they never paid that money back, and instead did this sleight of hand where they also came out and took everybody's home too. So they were okay. The bankers were okay. The mortgage bankers were okay, but they left the rest of us hanging out there. And I know this because I fought a lawsuit on it for 9 years. So I saw just how badly they did it. And yes, I'm resentful about that.
Well, right. And if I may too, they created what a lot of people don't know about called the shadow market. And I had just recently moved, so I was a little hyper aware of my surroundings. And I remember being out on a walk one day, May 9th, after my business had just tanked because of that. And because architecture is real estate generated. Mm-hmm. And it's a luxury, so it'll go away first, come back first, but it goes away first. But I was walking around the neighborhood, and about every fifth house had a for sale sign. Mm-hmm. But 2 out of every 4 in between were dark, and literally no lights on, nothing. I mean, you could just tell. And the week before, the kids were out playing in the street and et cetera, et cetera. And I go talk to a loan consultant friend of mine. He's like, well, have you heard of the shadow market? And what it is all those things disappeared to falsify supply and demand so that the supply was seemingly less and the price could be risen even. So to appreciate the remaining properties shown. If I may add one point to the previous three
Yeah.
that I haven't heard many, if any, psych professionals banner is the personal environmental consideration that primes people for fanatical resentment and for trauma, not to have wits, is not having the mentor-tormentor relationship with a parent. And with people like Trump, there's only the tormentor present. And that triggers and speaks to just opening up floodgates of traumas they have to keep them in a state of heightened psychological arousal. Right. And because of that, then just the one side, just tormentor rather than mentor, well, there's fanaticism. It's too one-sided. It's too side heavy. It's not usually top or bottom. It usually spins around out of control and the intensity on one side. So I feel like as you said before, a lot of people growing up without a mom or a dad, the single parent household. Well, that's cool, but then that person gets tired. And so their mentor-tormentor isn't on its game as much as a two-parent household, which can play hot potato, with the responsibilities. So I find that he specifically appealed to a whole group of people who probably grew up in relatively abusive or just generally loud households.
Right.
Always squabbling. And that creates fanatical resentment. Actually, it creates a primer. You're primed for receiving fanatical resentment because you're looking for direction, but you don't know that you have been since you were 5 or 4.
Right. And so anyway, my point is we have to know who the problem is, and what Wall Street has successfully done is played this magic trick where they divert you by worrying about things that don't really matter much in your life, like abortion, and meanwhile they steal from you out the back. So it happened in the crash of 2008. It's happening again now in the bailout for coronavirus, because up until December, the powers that be, which runs the GOP, basically had given almost nothing to the American people. They bailed out big business again. And I guess I got $600, over the last year. And then in December, after they'd lost the election, they finally ponied up another $600. But, that's chicken feed compared to the amount of money that's been put into the economy.
They're dropping a pan
at the top level. And, which is like $3 trillion. So where did $2 trillion go? That's the question. Mm-hmm. And I'll tell you where it is. It's in little green electrons in Swiss banks, because all the wealthy people just got wealthier. And so we have to redirect our attention to where the problem really is. And it isn't the Democrats. I mean, obviously, we have... we might get another $1,400 in the next month or two out of the Biden administration. That's more than we got out of Trump in over a year last year. So people's lives are going to be somewhat better thanks to the Democrats. And the other issue is, and you just see it operating, because the GOP just doesn't allow things to happen that get people better. And one example is when Barack Obama took office, he was talking about shovel-ready projects, public works projects like bridges and highways. And those projects were never really undertaken, and they're still out there. Okay, we still need to fix them. Things are 12 years worse since then. And so, and the reason they didn't get fixed is because if the GOP had allowed the budgeting for those highways and bridges, then Obama would have looked good because everybody would have gotten the jobs that they needed to replace the lost automotive industry jobs. And and so we have that issue again, which is we have to see whether the Biden administration can get some public works jobs through the Congress and help the economy get going again. That's the low-hanging fruit. But it, it has nothing to do with these social issues, which are complete bullshit.
Well, and to speak to that directly, Skip, in two particular points. One, they keep us fighting over gender issues. So there's an us and them versus male and female, which is
Right.
You need both for balance, and then you need people, period.
Right.
And I will say this publicly, and I've started saying this very publicly recently. I firmly feel there should be just as many laws governing women's bodies as there are men. And that number is exactly 0.
Yeah.
It's not about choice. It's about pride, integrity, and your well-being. And the second point I find is, I love Mark Twain's quote, and it's over 100 years old. It still applies. If you don't read the paper every morning, you are uninformed. And if you do read the paper every morning, you are misinformed. So when you see something, turn 180 degrees and look at what they're doing back over there, trying to scuttlebutt some hubbub in front of you and get you distracted again. So to me, environmental awareness again goes to wits and trauma, that if you just listen 3 times, like 1 to what's said, 2 who's saying it, and then 3 to what's being said, you can call bullshit and go, oh, I see, right over there. And it's hiding in plain sight.
Right.
So
and they do hide it in plain sight. I mean, the GOP will say these ridiculous things, and what they're doing is getting you to fight over something that doesn't matter, so that meanwhile they can steal some more money from you, from the country. And
it's the hidden bully on the playground, and everyone's kind of used to the being bullied. They don't want to be bullied, so they all of a sudden, I don't want to be bullied, and they think they have a political bent, and I need to stand up for myself. Well, if you already stood up, you're standing up, and you go, mm-mm.
Yeah, and the other thing is fiscal responsibility. Okay, while Trump was in office, they didn't worry about fiscal responsibility. They added $3 trillion to the debt last year, which is way more than any other president ever added to the debt in 1 year. And yet now, as soon as they're out of power, they start saying, oh, we got to worry about the national debt. Well, actually, no, we don't. Okay, that's one thing that people don't understand, is that in the macroeconomic sense, not microeconomics. Okay, so they talk about the national debt as if it's your family purse.
Checkbook,
checkbook, and you have to balance your checkbook. But at the macro level, they can issue as much money as they want to. Okay, and they simply don't. They're misers, and they don't want people to get better. And so that they don't allow us to get better. And
health is bad for that system.
Right. And
which is just I hate it, but it is.
Right. And so and the point is, there's no such thing as a national debt, actually. Okay, that's a contrived system that that just,
it's an insurance ruse.
Well, it makes sense at some levels, but the Federal Reserve Bank is actually a private bank, and so the federal government borrows money from this private bank. Well, that private bank doesn't have that money. They simply say, okay, you now have $100 billion or whatever it is to the federal government. And so then the federal government puts $100 billion on its financial statement, saying it owes that money to the Federal Reserve. But, oh, by the way, the Federal Reserve just created that money out of thin air. And
And they can leverage that debt to get other loans, like an insurance company would. When they pay, they sue their casualty company who pays them, who sues their casualty company who pays them. And if you had $100, you could fund the whole world because everybody's paying this $100 all the way around the world all the time.
Yeah.
I mean,
and so the average people can't understand that because it's quite complex. But what we have to know is that the answer to financial crisis, and we're hearing Janet Yellen talking about it again right now, is that we have to flood the market with money. And so they will pass the stimulus that Biden wants, or close to it, and so everybody will be happy because they'll get another $1,400, and that'll help for a month. But they actually could do much better than that.
In the macroeconomic sense, it's always interesting to me that it's the concept of the old promissory note, except you don't have to pay it back.
Right, and so. So the issue is we could run our money by simply having the Treasury issue money instead of having this Federal Reserve shell game, and that's called fiat currency. And Abraham Lincoln actually issued some fiat currency back in the old days, right? And I think it's still knocking around somewhere in the economy. But in any case, the point is that if they want to help the average citizen, they could do so. But the GOP is always these misers that don't want to help us out. And so they'd rather take our life savings, which is what they did to my life savings and lots of other people's back in 2008. And they basically harvested our life savings instead of helping us out when the crash happened. So they were fine. They got paid double on all defaulted mortgages, but the rest of us got screwed. But most people don't understand that. So naturally they're resentful because they lost their homes. 10 million families lost their homes. And, if you didn't lose your home, you lost a lot of value in your home at that time anyway, and in your assets. And they didn't care about that. They only cared that they were all right. So now they have a problem because they have huge reserves of little green electrons in Swiss banks, and they have no place to lend the money because they've destroyed the economies of these countries, including the United States. And so,
along with people's credit, so that then they can't, the avenues are actually corked and plugged so that people's credit goes down and they have less of an ability to work the debt system themselves.
Right. So it is natural. I mean, so I'm going to go back to this psychology of terrorism, which is that it's based on resentment. And, there is a lot of resentment. And even in my case, I have a lot of resentment about what happened to me in 2008 and the 10 years after that when I fought to keep my home. And by the way, I was not wrong on the law. I only, but the courts couldn't allow me to win because if I won, everybody would win. And they couldn't allow that. And so I got sacrificed. But the payback was I got my equity out of the house by staying in the house for 9 years and without paying. But that was the silver lining of the cloud for me, that I managed to stay in my home for 9 years without paying for it. And that was worth as much as I had in equity in my house. But it cost me, I figured about $2 million in legal fees to do that. And the house was not worth that, not anywhere near that. So the average citizen, because I'm an attorney, I could run that lawsuit, and I went to the Court of Appeals of Maryland 5 times, and the Supreme Court once, U.S. Supreme Court once. And, I was able to do all that work by myself. I filed over 4,000 pages of legal documents, most of which were typed up by me, but the average person can't do that.
Right.
And so,
well, in the secondary piece, then people losing their businesses. I mean, in the span on May 5th, 2008, in the span from noon to noon 42,
right.
my phone would not stop ringing. And then it did not ring for another 6 months. And in that 42 minutes, 2.5 years of retained under contract full-time work was gone because the real estate market couldn't support it. So people were they were pulling all of any tentacle of investments they had, investments they were trying to, put into the dirt and real estate, they were pulling everything back. It's like all the fishing rods came back in the boat. And I was on the other end of, dealing with a business that has to deal with other people's money, basically. So if their acceptable risk changes, it changes my relative income. And
right.
so
what you and I have just been talking about the last 15 minutes is hidden from the average person, and therefore they have resentment. They have resentment because their home was foreclosed or whatever it is, or they lost their business as you did, but they don't know where to direct their anger, and they think it must be the Democrats or something like that. And
like you lived in your house for 9 years because of your legal ability. And it took me from 2008 to 2014 to finally put my hands up from hard scrabble, pick and scratch to cobble something together to get the business back. But there came a point in 2014 where ground it, put it down, and start over. So that's all.
So in this article, the psychological injury that the people who were out there on the mall on January 6th had was in large part this socioeconomic deprivation. And it's not real deprivation. I mean, none of those people were starving to death. They were all overweight. 4 of them dropped dead of heart attacks during the event. So they weren't.
And
starving.
I understand you're not laughing at I get it, but you're laughing at the situation and not the. I get it.
They weren't starving to death, but the relative ability to have the good things in life is severe now, where we have 1% of the country owning, I think, over 50% of the assets of the country today, and that's just outrageous. And the only way that happens is because the GOP makes it happen. And
bigger fish, smaller fish, and after a while, there are fewer smaller fish. And
I vowed years ago that I would never vote for another Republican, even if somebody had a gun to my head, and I still won't, because they're just toadies to Wall Street interests. But unfortunately, they get away with it because they do all these look over here distraction efforts, so that people don't know it's them that's the real cause. So anyway, let's go
bait and switch.
Yeah. So let's go on. So what Dr. Lee is saying here is how do you solve it? One is to remove the offending agent. So we've done that. Trump is out of office now, but we need to make sure he stays out of office. 2 is we have to dismantle systems of thought control, which is common in advertising and has been adopted in politics. Well, that's going to take a big effort, but we have to really think through how we allow social networking to continue, because where we let anybody say anything they want to over a megaphone that has millions of people. And in Donald Trump's case, I guess he had 85 million Twitter followers. when he said something, it got out to everybody instantly. And so that's too big of a megaphone to give people, because
speaking of a megaphone too, even in the early 70s, radio stations started tuning to the frequency of, I think, 348 hertz. And if you look at 338 hertz, sacred geometry is created in the sound. Jimi Hendrix tuned his guitar to that hertz level. And so literally there's a bait in the how it sounds. Like it's almost there. You can't tell. It's still static. But in that 2 hertz change, a whole sacred geometry star that actually represents Om is formed in the sound structure. So even the dismantling of even how it's presented, the hidden factors of, if you know something about sound and you have a perfect pitch ear, you can go, it's yeah, that sounds beautiful, but it's still a little sharp or still a little flat, and you're not dialed into that harmonic. And even that subtlety, a lot of people don't even know to look for. They just know it sounds a little off, but not enough to not go to the grocery store. You know,
so that is one thing that we've got to fix, which is just how much we allow social networking companies to do what they're doing, what they've been doing, and how do we avoid losing our freedom of speech? That's a critical point. And
so the 4 points in this article, there was to remove the offending agent, dismantle systems of thought control. Had you gone through the other 2 yet, or before I got on?
No, there's one other.
Okay.
And there's more here, so just hold your horses.
Okay.
So the third one is the socioeconomic conditions, which causes poor mental health in society. So everybody's feeling put upon now, and therefore the mental health of the whole country is at risk right now, is what she's saying. Okay, next question. What do you predict he will do after his presidency? Talking about Trump. Here's what she says. I again emphasize and profile of a nation that we should consider the president, his followers, and the nation as an ecology, not in isolation. Hence, what he does after his presidency depends a great deal on us. This is the reason I frantically wrote the book over the summer. We require active intervention to stop him from achieving any number of destructive outcomes for the nation, including the establishment of a shadow presidency. We will have no limit. He will have no limit, which is why I've actively advocated for removal and accountability, including prosecution. We need to remember that he is more a follower than a leader, and we need to place constraints from the outside when he cannot place them from within. And so this goes to my point about the fact that Donald Trump never had anybody say no to him. And you know, the other example of that was, and very humorously described in the movie called Florence Foster Jenkins, Florence Foster Jenkins was this rich woman, very, very wealthy, and nobody ever said no to her because she made gifts to the opera and all sorts of other people, and she imagined that she was an opera singer, but she wasn't.
Right.
She was
painful, actually.
Yeah, she was terrible, but nobody ever said no to her because her donations to the Metropolitan Opera were the biggest. So
I would have to say, though, at least she used complete sentences. And in the last 4 years, I've seen a generally amoebic, unformed verb that has no direction and just a lot of sloppy inaction, surrounded by a lot of adjectives and no noun. There's never any subject matter that's completed in any sentence. So even in the inauguration, one of the most beautiful things was, wow, the English language still exists at that level. That's beautiful.
Right. Okay, going on. So anyway, this interview took place between January 6th and the new inauguration. So she was advocating even then, we got to get rid of this guy. And but the point is we also have to keep them out. And the only way we're going to do that is to put him in jail, or to make it so that he can't move, and we have to say no to him.
Well, and that last point of the socioeconomic deprivations that directly cause poor mental health. They don't lay a groundwork to prime it for bad mental health. They cause it.
Right.
They're literally flying too low in a plane and getting flak in the belly all the time. You're just
Right.
always in pain if you listen to it.
Right. Okay,
and they don't know not to.
Right. So let me just repeat for the audience that we're referring to an article which appeared in Scientific American. It's entitled "The Shared Psychosis of Donald Trump and His Loyalists," and it was published on the 11th of January. So next question, what do you think will happen to his supporters? Good question. Here's her answer. If we handle the situation appropriately, there will be a lot of disillusionment and trauma. And this is all right. They are healthy reactions to an abnormal situation. We must provide emotional support for healing. And this includes societal support, such as sources of belonging and dignity. Cult members and victims of abuse are often emotionally bonded to the relationship, unable to see the harm that is being done to them. While after a while, the magnitude of the deception conspires with their own psychological protections against pain and disappointment. This causes them to avoid seeing the truth. And the situation with Trump supporters is very similar. The danger is that another pathological figure will come around and entice them with a false solution that is really a harnessing of this resistance. And so here we're talking about what do you do about, Uncle Bob and his dedication to Trump. And you have to understand them. You have to somehow say, okay, it's all right that you got drawn off this way because you can still be a normal person after
Right.
this. And so the example, the big examples in the 20th century were World War I and World War II. So after World War I, the Treaty of Versailles was very punitive. And the result was that it stoked resentment among the German people and stoked it in a whole new generation that was coming up to backfill the deaths that they'd had in the 19 teens. And so the punitive Treaty of Versailles just caused huge resentment in Germany, and they were ready to go to war again. Whereas after World War II, we had the Marshall Plan, where we rebuilt Germany and Japan. So these two countries that we had been at war with, we literally rebuilt. And so today they're our best allies, are among our best allies. And so by reconstructing them, we have to reconstruct our relatives who have gone down this path, basically.
And one of the pieces there too that's the magnet is the football pep rally. People don't understand that policy and such, it doesn't have to take a long time, but traditionally it's going to. There's part of it is a thoughtful process to make sure you don't get a bad contract, so to speak, and then people picking out things that shouldn't be there. But there's the kind of call to arms, and even if they don't do anything, just the cheerleading pep rally of banging your chest, or we're going to do all these things. Well, it's like someone in the front of an aerobics class saying 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. This gets them going. And then they don't even have to go to the football game. Yeah. They go to the next pep rally. And there's always this keeping the system in trauma. And there's no game, except the one behind the scenes.
Right. And that's what we did allow, which was Trump to do his pep rallies. Now, Rocket King says, I feel like today is paradoxically the best and worst of times to be alive. So many opportunities, yet so many hindrances, so many progressions, yet so many regressions. And you're absolutely right, Rocket King. And it sounds like you're quoting the first page of A Tale of Two Cities.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And
right.
Black market babies, and it's
yeah, and Henry,
in the book. Not, I
right,
mean, that's
right. And Henry says, shared psychosis of Donald Trump and his followers. Why is it that when I encounter Americans of all types, they're completely obsessed with Donald Trump? Haven't we learned about projection? Well, the answer to that is no, we haven't. And we need more discussion and teaching about psychology and psychiatry, but especially psychology. And so most people have no clue what you mean when you start talking about projection. And so
and I would say too that, and projection, basically putting your contents on another person, but there's something more insidious than projection, and that's the capital P, projective identity. Right. People will actually supplant themselves on someone to do their own bidding. So it's abrogation, relinquishing of responsibility.
Right. And so so we project on to Trump because he's the one that's out there to receive the projection. The only problem is that when the person being projected upon is psychotic, then it creates a psychosis in the society. And this was what Edward Edinger was always worried about, and why I read at the beginning of this session The Psychology of Terrorism from Archetype of the Apocalypse by Edward Edinger. And Dr. Edinger was always worried about a psychic epidemic, and talking about how Nazism and even communism in Russia, which is the opposite end of the spectrum, they're both group psychic epidemics. And so the communists all fell for the idea of, okay, let's make everybody equal. And then they said, oh, well, this isn't equal, so we're going to enforce it. And what they did in the end was they created another oligarchy. And there's a great book about this called The Red Tsar that I highly recommend reading, which is the story of Stalin and how many people he murdered to make things equal. Yes, it didn't make things equal.
Well, and the groupthink too leads to flocking behavior. And then people are moving just to be in synchrony or in tandem with everybody else, rather than for a motivated reason that they buy into, just simply so they don't get basically banged up in the traffic of people.
Right. And Patrick says Trump was the strange attractor. Yes, he definitely was. Mm-hmm. And he piled on this situation where there was this resentment in society, and there is still. I mean, I'm still resentful about what happened in 2008, but I see that it has to be, my resentment has to be solved in a different way. And one of those ways is by doing this session right now. I'm talking about my resentment and the understandable resentment of a lot of the Americans that were out on that mall that particular day. Now, there were some bad actors in there, but a lot of those people were just pulled along by this tide of Trump and didn't know what they were doing, which was very obvious when you saw the videos of them, and they get to the Senate. Senate's empty, and they said, "Where is everybody?" They don't have a clue. They didn't have a clue. They didn't have a plan. They just got pulled along, and they got into the Senate chamber, and they didn't know what to do, except go sit in the chairs or something like that. They thought that was somehow meaningful. And So lots of those people were just pulled along by the psychological situation, but we need to understand that. Okay, we need to understand that psychological situation.
You know, I saw a meme yesterday, and it had the title was "To Take a Stand," and on the left you had Colin Kaepernick taking a knee, and of course he was demonized and kicked out of the NFL.
Yeah.
And then you had the guy who was stealing the stand, the podium, walking away in the White House, and that's celebrated. So that there's a whole different gig going on in both of those images.
Okay, so Patrick says, how would you describe parallels of the Trump presidency in World War II Germany with the rise of Nazism? Well, it's very simple, Patrick. Adolf Hitler in 1923 had 7 followers, and but he played on the resentment, exactly the same thing. Okay, he played on the resentment of the German people, and in his speeches, he very often referred to the Diktat of Versailles. And that was one of the phrases that he often used in his speeches, because it was the punitive behavior of the Allies toward the German people which caused the resentment. So he would just open that wound every time he could, and
then also Joseph Goebbels, his one of his chief people, would basically, his whole philosophy was make the lie as big as possible and repeat it as much as possible. And what happens then, if they can get you to believe absurdities, they can cause you to commit atrocities.
Right. And there's a comment here from someone named Michael that I'm not going to allow on my chat. I'm sorry, Michael, because you don't understand what you're talking about. So, okay. So
I would say that people out in the chat as well, be thoughtful.
Yeah.
Be
All
thoughtful.
right.
But if you come in hot, well, no one really wants to listen to that on either side. So,
okay. So the next question. How can we avert future insurrection attempts? Wait a minute. Okay, I'm sorry.
you jump forward.
I jumped forward. Okay, so the question is, what do you think will happen to his supporters? The full answer, I'll read the full answer. If we handle the situation appropriately, there will be a lot of disillusionment and trauma, and this is all right. They are healthy reactions to an abnormal situation. We must provide emotional support for healing, and this includes societal support, such as sources of belonging and dignity. Cult members and victims of abuse are often emotionally bonded to the relationship, unable to see the harm that is being done to them. After a while, the magnitude of the deception conspires with their own psychological protections against pain and disappointment. Okay, I did read that before, but the thing I wanted to come back to is where she says there will be a lot of disillusionment and trauma. And we also already see that where the Proud Boys and other groups are now disowning Trump. Okay,
and that's a healthy. And that she goes on to say that's a healthy response to trauma,
right?
And that's one thing too. Is I think the old military term is embrace the suck. Be uncomfortable for a while, run it, let it happen, and see what gold you can mine from that.
Right. Okay. So the next question then is, how can we avert future insurrection or acts of violence? And Dr. Lee says, violence is the end product of a long process. So prevention is the key. Structural violence or inequality is the most potent stimulant of behavioral violence. The reducing inequality in all forms, economic, racial, and gender, will help toward preventing violence. For prevention to be effective, knowledge and in-depth understanding cannot be overlooked, so we can anticipate what is coming, much like the pandemic. The silencing of mental health professionals during the Trump era, mainly through a politically driven distortion of ethical guidelines, was catastrophic, in my view, in the nation's failure to understand, predict, and prevent the dangers of this presidency. Okay, so she's talking about the silencing of mental health professionals, and this is a reference to the Goldwater rule of the American Psychiatric Association. And Dr. Lee has been outspoken during the entire Trump presidency, but she's one of the very few, and she very courageously did it, wrote books about it, brought a few others into it. She actually apparently created another organization, of which she is the president. It's called the World Mental Health Coalition. And here's what they say about that. One such person is Bandy Lee, a forensic psychiatrist and president of the World Mental Health Coalition. Lee led a group of psychiatrists, psychologists, and other specialists who questioned Trump's mental fitness for office in a book that she edited called The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. 27 psychiatrists and mental health experts assess a president. In doing so, Lee and her colleagues strongly rejected the American Psychiatric Association's modification of the 1970s era guideline known as the Goldwater Rule that discouraged psychiatrists from giving a professional opinion about public figures who they have not examined personally. Whenever the Goldwater Rule is mentioned, we should refer back to the Declaration of Geneva, which mandates that physicians speak up against destructive governments, Lee says. This declaration was created in response to the experience of Nazism. So the point is that, the American Psychiatric Association intimidated most of the psychiatrists in the world to not talk about it.
And also that's important that they did rebut that, because the mental health and health professions are the first catchment area of forensic trouble. You will find your problems arising there first. Symptoms slowly creeping, the scope creep of things getting worse. And so I'm really pleased that she and 27 others spoke out, because there was enough. I mean, enough. And I respect that they did.
Yeah. So going on here, do you have any advice for people who do not support Trump but have supporters of him or mini Trumps in their lives? Now here's the issue about Uncle Bob and what do you do about him? Okay. This is often very difficult because the relationship between Trump and his supporters is an abusive one. As an author of the 2017 book I entitled Dangerous Case of Donald Trump presciently pointed out, when the mind is hijacked for the benefit of the abuser, it becomes no longer a matter of presenting facts or appealing to logic. Removing Trump from power and influence will be healing in itself, but I advise first not to confront his supporters' beliefs, for it will only arouse resistance. Second, persuasion should not be the goal, but change of the circumstance that led to this faulty belief. Third, one should maintain one's own bearing and mental health, because people who harbor delusional narratives tend to bulldoze over reality in their attempt to deny that their own narrative is false. Okay, and so so the key point here is we can't confront people who are Trump supporters, because it will only make them more insistent on the rightness of their position.
Well, I think you have another perspective that I would like to bring up, if you would speak to it, that this to me is like when people come back from war, you don't confront them about the war, you welcome them in, period. And it's on their terms that things will come out or not, or heal or not. But to me, with people of trauma, they have been in a war, and that experience occurred, right or wrong. Whether their belief was right or wrong doesn't matter. They still have been harmed, hurt, and are in pain. And that to me is first, it's a welcoming. And there are no terms and conditions. It's just bring them in, bring them home,
Yeah.
you know.
And they always will be. Okay. I
Right.
mean, I have enough PTSD myself, which is very minor. And I always emphasize that my PTSD is very minor, but and compared to others who have far worse. But my point is, I'm back from Vietnam now 50 years. Okay, it'll be 50 years this April since I came back, and whenever two triggering events occur to me, it triggers my PTSD. One of those is when a helicopter flies by, and because I live right next to the Naval Academy, that's often. And when a helicopter flies by, I'm immediately back in mind of Vietnam, number one. And the second one is when there's fireworks. I can no longer, and haven't been able for 50 years, to actually go to an outdoor fireworks display. I can watch it on television, but if I go to an outdoor fireworks display, it just puts me right back into Vietnam, and it creates tremendous anxiety. And so I just don't go to fireworks displays, and haven't done for 50 years.
You just clearly expressed too, one of the trickiest parts of trauma is that trauma does not age. Trauma is always fresh, as if it happened a second ago. And at those trigger events, it's present as if you were already, not like you were back there. It's here now. I mean, so it pours right back in. So I think the trauma is always fresh. Starts to defeat some people because they get tired of the process. Every time it comes, it's there until it's not. And then there you go. And so it's not a matter of, oh, we're 80% better, we're 90% better. If the trauma is still present to be triggered, it's 100% all the time. And it's not black and white. And so it's a matter of also, I think, engaging in the process so that
right.
the things can heal.
This is why I always ask the question, why did dear old dad not talk about the war? Well, right. It was traumatic is the point. And unless, and who would want to bring that onto a family of women and children? You know, and so my father-in-law was like that, and he never spoke of it. But then when I came into the family, he could speak about it to me, and he really wanted to speak about it to me because I would understand what he was talking about, but he didn't want to speak about it to his wife and children.
Well, and that exposes one of the chief psychological lies we're fed, is that time heals all wounds. No, it actually doesn't. Time just simply adds a perspective to be able to inspect, look at, experience, re-experience, and heal the wound, because the effect of it, the concussion blast, has eroded over time, but it did not heal anything. Inaction will never do anything.
Right, and this is one of Dr. Jung's points about neurosis generally. Okay, so there's two ideas in psychology. One is neurosis and one is psychosis. Now, psychosis is actually mental disease or defect, and that's typically handled by psychiatrists. and very often they do so with pharmaceuticals of some sort. But in the case of neurosis, this is basically a set of opposites that are clashing in your mind, and you can't get your mind around them, and so they cause depression and other things. And Dr. Jung's point was that you can't cure a neurosis. What you can do is you draw a fence around them and put them off in this corner of your mind and say, oh yeah, that's there, but I'm not going to let it bother me. It's like me with PTSD. You know, the helicopter flies by and I'm back in Vietnam, and then I say, oh yeah, I have that PTSD, and I put it off in the side of my mind, and it doesn't bother me anymore, but it's always triggered. And so neurosis is like that. You know, you're always going to have this conflict that's there, but you learn to live around it, basically. And that's what a psychologist might do, I suppose. Now let's see. I'm just looking.
And I'll not speak to that from an opposing view, from a brain spotting parts perspective that could unravel those. That'd be a different conversation.
Yeah, okay. So Henry says there's a pandemic, hundreds of thousands are dying, millions hungry, tens of millions may lose their homes. The vaccination effort for the virus is being delayed, and we are obsessed with Trump. Well, yeah, and
the vaccination rollout, Biden, this is no surprise, but Biden arrived into office. There wasn't even a draft vaccination rollout plan. It started from scratch. Right. So nothing was done at all, just a bunch of blah, blah, blah.
Well, yeah, I mean, Trump is simply shorthand for all these issues that you raise. And thank you, Patrick, for your comment. Michael says, regarding Trump and shadow projection, many of the projections were so extreme and seemed out of touch with reality. And sure, Trump is narcissistic, but Hitler doubtful, authoritarian within. Okay, I'm not going to argue that. I'm not a mental health professional, and that's a sterile debate at this point.
And I have to say that Trump didn't have enough self-discipline to become a demagogue.
Yeah, I mean,
he doesn't. He can't grow into anything except more diapers.
Right. So anyway, I'm not going to argue the relative merits of Trump and Hitler's mental health.
Right. That's a minefield in itself.
So Mistel says, we think we become desensitized. However, brushing against a wound, no matter how old, will always cause you to flinch a little. Yes, I mean, that's my point with my PTSD.
And trauma's always fresh. That's one of the pieces that I've found that is the most important to know about it.
Yeah, and Max says, my father was a Marine, a Vietnam vet, and he was my greatest blessing. It took him years to come home, but he finally did. He was kind, tough, and a democratic socialist. Well, good. Hopefully, I'm something like that.
It's good to hear, though. That story's powerful.
I mean, you know, in terms of this coming home issue, I mean, there were men who came home from Vietnam and were spit upon in San Francisco airport, and they were traumatized by that, and but that was not my experience, and I don't want to I don't want to emphasize that experience, because I don't think that was the experience of most Vietnam vets. I mean, when I came home, my father-in-law had painted on a door horizontally, "Welcome home, Skip," and he'd hung it over his garage door. And I just went back into society. I mean, 5 months later, I went to law school, but when I came back, I went to Quantico and started training other officers. I became a staff platoon commander at Officer Candidate School. And so I just was still in the Marines and doing Marine things. And then when I finally left active duty, the last month was August of 1971. I was just swimming in the Niagara River and getting ready to go to law school. So, I never really thought about anybody being resentful. Any of the Vietnam War protesters being resentful toward me, and I never experienced that personally.
And the San Fran spitting on the people coming home, that's spitting on the tip of the spear. You got to look at the cause of the spear. I mean,
right.
Was it Mark Twain again? He said, "I'm always a patriot. I'm behind my country 100% all the time. I'm behind my government only when it deserves it." So,
right. And, my perspective of it is that, several of my very good friends were either draft dodgers or draft dodgers, they went to Canada, or
right.
I have a very good friend who deserted, actually. Those guys were right. What we did in the Vietnam War was not the right thing. And I knew that from 1962, which was 3 years before we admitted that we were in Vietnam, because in the summer of 1962, I was with my father in Yokosuka, Japan, which is at the mouth of Tokyo Bay. And one evening, he took me down to the docks, and he showed me a line of ships going out of Tokyo Bay, gray hulls, Navy ships. And so I was 15 at the time. And he said, see that, Skip? And I said, yeah, Dad. And he says, that's the Marines. They're going to Vietnam. And then he said, everyone in the military is either in Vietnam now, has been there, or is going there. And I said, why, Dad? And he said, because the generals need to have a war in order to make rank, and there hasn't been a war since World War II, 15 years, and so they need a war to get more ribbons on their chest, basically, is what he said. And that seemed really stupid to me. And so from that time, from 1962, I knew that the war was wrong. But at the same time, 1964, when August of 1964, when Lyndon Johnson declared at noon one fine day that he was going to eliminate the marriage exemption from the draft at midnight that day. So there were 12 hours left. And immediately there were lines of couples around county courthouses trying to get married so that the men could avoid being drafted. And I felt that was cowardice. And I still feel having bone spurs was cowardice too. I
get a pad.
But in a way, we're lucky that Trump always is now and always was a coward, because he didn't follow through on what he was doing on January 6th. I mean, he could have made it much worse. Mm-hmm. And he never would have succeeded, but he could have made it much worse if he tried to be a demagogue that day.
And I wonder on that day too, just the old Sun Tzu philosophy of no real quick response of it'll run its course, because never interrupt someone when they're making a mistake. Let them go all the way through to the end, because they'll take out most of their stuff.
Right. So in any case, in the case of the Vietnam War, I was seeing it both ways. So when I went to college, there was never any doubt in my mind that I was going to go in the military and into, I mean, it was the family business for me. My father had been a career Navy officer. And it turned out that I couldn't see. And so I couldn't get a commission in the Navy, and I didn't want to serve as an enlisted man. So I joined the Marines, and it was a good solution for me, very much so. And okay, so Manuela says, "Wow, all my respect to you, Skip. Vietnam is like our war in Argentina with England. Young men used for political reasons in the name of patriotism." Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's a very good example.
Yeah. And Patrick says, "I wish Trump would have left with more class. I'm a bit disappointed." Well, he never had any class. he maybe he had a class by birthright of being a wealthy man from the beginning, but he never had any class in terms of that earned him respect.
A little Lord Fauntleroy.
Yeah, and you know.
And that's the thing is, I think a lot of people
hope.
Yeah, I think a lot of people hope that there would be this magical change at the end, and he'd go, "Oh, okay, you can have it. I'll concede and be a decent human being." But the thing is, he's not a decent human being. So the only thing I can say is, at least he has some integrity. That the psychosis is pretty well ingrained.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a last point that she makes here. As for the mini Trumps, it is important above all to set firm boundaries, to limit contact, or even to leave the relationship if possible. Because so her point is, if you've got an Uncle Bob that is always going to be talking about how Trump was wronged and all that stuff, just don't invite him to Thanksgiving anymore. Yeah, that's.
And I would also say, be very mindful of the tactic of shaming behavior. And if you can't fully express your perspective, if just an external influence gets them going, leave. I mean, you're in danger. Because that what happens is they associate external influences with their abusers. And if you don't match, mirror, and parrot what they said and what they want you to say, and you have your own perspective, it actually scares them. It puts them back in trauma. So be mindful of shaming behavior.
Right.
It's just a subtle drip to keep things in that false line.
Right. And so finally, she says, because I specialize in treating violent individuals, I always believe there is something that can be done to treat them, but they seldom present for treatment unless forced. And so, the point is, Uncle Bob isn't going to go see a psychiatrist.
Right.
And
because everybody else has a problem. Uncle Bob doesn't have a problem.
And so if you have somebody in your household or in your family that behaves badly, and I did have in one of my grandfathers, you just stay away from them. And fortunately for me, I mean, my grandfather was the most bigoted man I ever met, and he had a name for every race, color, and national origin, and and he lived in my household for 8 years. But fortunately, my father was in the Navy, and he got himself stationed in Japan, and my grandfather's reaction to that is, "I ain't gonna go live with them Japs." That was the way he responded to it. And so when we left for Japan in my sophomore year of high school, he stayed behind, and thank God, then he was out of my life.
Mm-hmm.
And I probably only saw him once or twice after that. And one of those 2 times, he was already in dementia, so he didn't even know who I was anymore.
The best way to argue with those kind of people, don't.
Yeah. And he and I had real knockdown, drag out battles before we went to Japan. But, I do see in fullness of time, I mean, he was great in other ways, but, and he had a troubled young manhood, but anyway, he was out of my life, and that was a good thing. And so, if you have somebody that's like that, just don't invite him to Christmas dinner or Thanksgiving dinner anymore if you can do it.
Well, and you and he have the model there of you, not an idyllic life, but there was resentment from him that his youth was crushed, and yours wasn't. Yours was
Right.
actually moved forward and celebrated and enhanced. So there's a marked difference of how he came out. That's what trauma does, versus how you came out. That's what influence does. And the difference of influence is positive trauma, basically.
Right. Now, Patrick says, I don't hate Trump. Well, I don't hate Trump either. Okay, because honestly, I had to evaluate my own shadow in terms of Donald Trump. And I acknowledge that many of the things he did from a policy point of view, I would have done if I had been in his position. So I know that a lot of things that he did, I too would have done if I'd been in his position. And so I can't hate that person because he represents part of me, my own shadow, and I can admit that. And
I'll say I don't either. I think hate to me.
No, I feel sorry for him.
Yeah, and I have pity. There's a pathetic quality, and I don't find that to be judgmental. It's sad, frankly.
Yeah. Yeah, and he's going through a very bad time right now, which is what Dr. Lee says, which is he's not going to have any more of these rallies anymore that think he's wonderful, or maybe he will, but if he does, then we're in deep trouble.
Well, and also too, to go back to your piece there with just his way, and say trauma with your grandfather's youth being troubled and crushed in a way. Trump had a monster of a father. I couldn't call him a dad, and a doormat of a mom. And then in that imbalance was never told no also. So just imagine the monster that is promoted and modeled.
Right. So Intrepid makes a good point. He says, I think media played a big part in the problems you have in the U.S. I think you need to have laws in place with regard to defamation and puffery. We have strong puffery laws in Australia. And I do agree that the media, trumped up lots of stuff. And we do have defamation laws, and Donald Trump is being sued for defamation. I think one of the problems we have is that we gave him a get out of jail free card, and by not allowing prosecution during his presidency, and that needs to be fixed, I think. Now, I need Jordan. Are you looking at the YouTube chat?
No, I'm not. I don't have it. I'm on the Zoom.
Okay, I'm going to let you go for a minute because I need to bio break.
Okay. I had a point. Oh, bear with me. in regards to the puffery, that's a good comment. And we do have some, but I think one of the pieces here is actually just the word media. These days, it feels like 15 to 20 years since we've had journalism. And journalism actually getting in forensically with facts and telling the story of what's going on. It doesn't always out people. It's here's what's happening. That's journalism, and that's important. And it leans towards truth. It's probably always perspective and perception, but media. And I was actually walking my dog yesterday, and she stopped, and I looked over, and there was a window open and a big flat screen TV. And I noticed the change, and I started counting. No frame was on for more than 4 seconds. Not 4 seconds before something changed or a ticker moved. And so it feels like that's really grooving bad habits of quick fixes and shallow roots. And some things take time. So it feels to me just that piece of, why don't I watch the news with my eyes closed? See what I actually hear, instead of the constant barrage of the scene changing, which keeps me in a always starting over perspective. So I appreciate your comment, and from Australia, and especially in Australia, because I mean, everything in Australia will kill you. I mean, you've got such a great country that is also so vibrant and intense at the same time. So welcome back, Skip.
Yeah.
I made the point of that. I think one of the pieces of the problem in that puzzle, I appreciate the comment about the puffery, but is that we have the word media rather than journalism. And I made a point that yesterday when I was walking my dog, I stopped when she stopped, and I looked over, and a window was open, big flat screen. No image was on for more than 4 seconds. So is always in trauma, always keeping something moving in. So you never really got your bearings.
Right. Well, and the media and our leaders do try to keep us
on point.
Yeah. So we don't have our bearings. And in fairness to my maternal grandfather, who I defamed earlier, he had the experience, and I would love to be able to talk to him about it now, that he was engaged to a woman who, together with her 4 sisters, all died on the same weekend from the Spanish flu in 1918. And obviously that was quite traumatic. And
wow,
two years later, he married my grandmother. But and so that's why we're having this conversation now. So it would be wonderful to be able to talk to him about what it was like back in the great Spanish flu days. But unfortunately,
right, that pandemic.
But I mean, and his bigotry came from the fact that, he was born in 1879, believe it or not. And so that was the same year as the Little Bighorn, the same year as Custer's Last Stand. So he came through at a completely different time in American history. And it was just too tough for him by the time he was in his 80s when he was living with me.
So, and I think too, there are laws in place for puffery, slander, libel, but the problem is they're not enforced when all we have is a barrage of what's on Facebook, what's on YouTube. It's all these flat, and basically we're flying through a flat field, and we can't you got to raise your own plane, fly above it. Yeah. So, I mean, that's an important point.
Okay, so there's an interesting point here. Tim makes a point. As bad as Trump was, the vindictive actions toward him at the end seems outrageous to me. Talk about Trump derangement syndrome. Well, Dr. Lee has clearly said that we need to, there have to be consequences for some of the things that he did, which were illegal and had damaged us very much. And if there aren't consequences, then he'll come back right back, and we'll have other people who will pick up his banner and continue to do the same things to our country, which is really bad. Manuela says, sadly, nowadays, war is more silence and efficiency. So your USA casualties are less, but innocent populations in other countries have been destroyed are more. Yep. You don't want to be in a war with the United States today. Even though I'm a career military man, the destructiveness of the U.S. military is way bigger than when we were in the Vietnam War. If we had those weapons then, and I'm not talking about nuclear weapons, the Vietnam War would have been over in a New York minute. And I just give an example. The Air Force has a bomb that will suck all of the oxygen out of a square kilometer, or actually out of a cubic kilometer. And when it does that, every human being that's in that cubic kilometer basically has their lungs coming out of their mouth. And so it's a very deadly weapon. And there are other examples, but I was just thinking in terms of the first Gulf War, where
it's a vacuum bomb, basically a depressurization bomb.
Right. And in terms of the first Gulf War, we lined up the American forces 60 miles out of Baghdad, I think, and then they just stopped for 2 weeks. And the news media was talking about, oh, the Republican Guard are so tough, and we're going to have to face them. And after this two-week layback, and no, we didn't, because what happened was they used that kind of weaponry against them, and then we just drove into Baghdad. There was no battle for Baghdad, and
which was good, because Baghdad is a beautiful city with the history and culture in that city is powerful. So I appreciate the silent treatment of just sit back and wait and let them play it out until they get tired, and then, okay, come on in.
Yeah.
Because that city destroyed would have been quite a shame, frankly.
Yeah. Yeah, and Henry says even academics and intelligentsia can be drawn into the web. And how well I know this, because I have several folks in my own family that would vote for Trump even today.
And I think it brings to mind, trauma affects everyone regardless of your IQ or your EQ. It's part of life. And so I think it's the people who are able to weather, stay the course, deal with, or as Skip said, in some places you have to compartmentalize it and push it to the side.
Yeah. So I want to start to draw this to an end, but the Big Cat says the movie Network in 1977 was prophetic. Absolutely, that
exactly.
Resentment that was expressed there is the same resentment that we're faced with, and we have to address.
Isn't that the one where he's out on the fire escape
Right. And Manuela says journalists can not survive in mass media because the owners of them have their own agenda, and that's a big issue.
Handlers, basically journalists with handlers, rather than Woodward and Bernstein, who handle themselves on behalf of someone else, but not by someone else.
Over the last 4 years, I've really been feeling sorry for some of the news readers, the anchors, but because every hour they've been having to say the same thing over and over and over again.
Right.
And it doesn't change that much over time.
Remember Walter Cronkite, and that's what happened today, this day, January 24th, 2021. I mean, it was different every time.
And here's the big cat says, plus we're in a postmodern era where truth is subjective. Well, truth is subjective. And so we do need to not rely on our bosses in the government to tell us what's true and what's not true. We have to be able to decide for ourselves. And one of the problems that we have, at least in the United States, is we've stopped teaching social studies in public schools. So most people don't even have a clue about
what social studies was
and how things work in the world. And that's a problem. We have to educate our populations.
Well, truth is also a bit like perfection. And I love Salvador Dali. He says, don't worry about being perfect. You'll never get there. I mean, so it's not something that's another false distraction. The ultimate capital T truth. Right. I mean, I could put 4 philosophers in a room, really good ones, and we'd have a long conversation, but we'd have to go to bed and we wake up and do it again the next. It's not going to get anywhere. There's just going to be a lot of good fodder for thought. But to me, the absolute truth, maybe at death, but prior to, it's not. It's a distraction.
Yeah. So the big cat says Bush too had America occupying the whole Middle East in his effort for a new American century. It was a geopolitical move. We are experiencing blowback abroad and at home from that. and then Patrick responds, so sad to see Syria. And I agree entirely with that. And, you know, the fact is, we don't have to, by geopolitics and by strength of armies, the United States no longer needs to have geopolitical control of every place because, you know, the U.S. is the lead in the world, whether anybody else wants to admit that or not. But we have the biggest economy, and by far, notwithstanding what China has been able to do, but their economy is way behind ours. Russia is about equal to Italy in terms of economy size. And so, and plus we do air our grievances and we have a worldwide platform through cable television. So the result is the whole world has become Americanized, let's say, in the last 30 years, whether we admit it, whether anyone wants to admit it or not. And it's not a matter of pride, it's a matter of fact. And so, you know, some people are saying, well, the U.S. is the policeman of the world. Well, you know, I didn't want to admit that 20 years ago, but the reality is that we are, and we're the only ones that have the capability to even do that. And so we have to do it in a beneficent way. If we don't, it becomes really troublesome.
Well, even in the 80s, I mean, some countries could reduce or eliminate their recon security forces by just getting a room full of people with subscription to CNN, and they just let the news come to them because everyone's outing everything.
Yeah. So Intrepid says, when one watches what they think is trusted media site, for example, Fox, and they are told exaggerated information instead of research fact, they're going to believe it. That's where puffery laws help. Right. Well, okay, yeah, maybe, but you know, that is a problem. And I mean, I'll give you an example. The other day, during the inauguration, we, my wife said, "Oh, let's just turn over to Fox for a minute and show what they're reporting." And so everybody else had been reporting this wonderful day that we had, this pageant of America, which included that amazing fireworks display at the end. And so everybody else is showing that. Fox was showing some sort of vandalism in Seattle and saying, "Oh, our cities are falling apart." Well, baloney. I mean, yes, there's vandalism, and there's vandalism all the time by different groups for various reasons, and they're criminals, but that doesn't mean the country is falling apart. And 60 years ago, when I was a kid, you wouldn't even have heard of that because nobody would be reporting on something like that.
Well, and news isn't supposed to be interesting. It's supposed to tell you what's in your environment. And it gives you a swivel head survey of what's going on. And that whole sensationalist bent of, the whole world's all going to heck. Well, it's always been going to heck. And it's like my grandmother used to always say, there are only 2 days in a year you can't do anything about it. And that's yesterday and tomorrow. So get on it. I mean, so it's the kind of thing we're listening, I think, to what's going on. That was an American pageant. I mean, the youth poet laureate, 22 years old, and Amanda Gorman, that's a voice of hope for generations to come.
Wow, she was awesome. She is awesome.
I mean, that was exquisite, beautiful.
Yeah, and I've seen some videos of her when she won the Youth Poet Laureate designation. Oh my God, she is amazing.
Well, and she had a speech difficulty, and she had problems even to 3 years ago with the letter R, like glass and grass kind of thing.
Yeah.
And she just, I can't remember which song, but she found a song that had R's all through it. And she just tried to sing along until she got it. Yeah, I mean, so there's trauma and what can happen when you address it. She let that become part of her poetry program, basically.
Right. And so Max makes a point, quote, "War is a racket," unquote, stated by Smedley Butler, U.S. Marine Corps. It was actually in 1935. And yes, he did say that. And he said that because a bunch of oligarchs like the ones that have been pushing Trump forward were trying to take over the country with the same sort of thing back in the mid 30s. And they tried to hire Smedley Butler to be the military leader that would take over for them, and he told them to go screw a tree, I think. And so what can I say? We do have checks and balances in the military. For example, just this last week, when we had all the National Guard's troops coming into Washington, they brought them in from every state. And there's a reason for that. And that is that they're not all going to think alike. And we actually do that, for example, with the service academies. For example, every senator and congressman gets to appoint somebody to the Naval Academy and to West Point and to the Air Force Academy and so on. And the reason for that is then you get a diversity of people from all over the country, and they have relationships with people from all over the country. So you don't have, the children of the men who did Sheridan's March to the Sea, for example, or any of that. And so the result is that you get a wide perspective in the military, in the U.S. military. And so these are quite intentional things that are done in order to keep balance in the U.S. military. Mm-hmm. And thank God for that.
Well, it keeps the perspectives, and things evolve differently in different landscapes. I mean, different environments have different constitutions. I mean, your personal constitution, what you can take, how you can take it. I mean, if I grew up and it was 105 degrees for 3 days in a row in the middle of summer. For 5 days, it wasn't under 100. And for 100 days in a row, the high was at least 100.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're, you walk out from 68 degrees inside, you start switching it up to 70 something, because you don't want a 50-degree temperature differential,
Mm-hmm.
just because of the trauma. I mean, but the ability to withstand different extremes, different parts of the states have different kinds of extremes.
Right.
So, and that breeds different perspectives. So I appreciate that the catchment area, bringing them all together.
Okay, well, the last thing I want to talk about today before we hang up is just levels of experience. And, there's one thing about Donald Trump which made him peculiarly ineffective as president. And that was the fact that he didn't have any experience in the military, and he had no experience in the government, didn't know how the government worked. And so he just didn't get it. And a lot of the people that he brought into his administration also didn't get it. And so, for example, they thought they could cram through this guy to be the general counsel of the National Security Agency without, just forcing him into office last Tuesday or something like that. Well, they found out, pretty quick. He was put on administrative leave immediately, because if you're going to be the general counsel of the National Security Agency, you would have to have such high security clearances that nobody else has. And those clearances are only granted to people who have long experience in the government and so on. And so there was no way in hell that guy could succeed, but nonetheless, they tried to pull that stunt. And
your levels of experience, the DNA of that was on January 6th, because let's assume, just for sake of argument, that they got in and they kidnapped some senators or took over. Let's just make it simple. I'll be
over what? Took over
exactly.
what?
Exactly. So when they sit in the chair and now, okay, we won. What did you win? No one's there. And now let's assume you actually took over the government. What are you going to do with it? You don't have any experience to know what's going on. And so when they got in there, they're basically going into class on Saturday, because everyone has already been vacated the premises.
Yeah, I mean, just imagine if the leader of the Proud Boys had appointed himself president. Okay, now he calls on either the CIA or the NSA to give him a security briefing. Well, no, they're not going to do that.
No, they're just going to come with their zip ties. Take him away.
Exactly.
Take him away.
And so, I mean, geez, what people think. So the point is that if we're going to elect people to high office, we have to select people who are experienced, that know how things work, that know how to get things done. And I'm hopeful for the Biden administration that they will bring in a crew that's much more seasoned and mature. Let's see. We'll give them a chance. I'm not saying everything that they do will be good, but on the other hand, the GOP was saying, God, the world's going to go to hell if Barack Obama was elected. But oh, by the way, the Obama presidency was one of the quietest in history, and things were good in the country.
And he had grace and tact with how to utilize his intellect. I mean,
that's right. And he had grace about the issues of color that he faced, which were substantial, but he just let the water go off his back. So, and so let's see, Memo says, if people cannot read between the lines in news and social media, it is hopeless. Well, not everybody has to read, has to understand what's going on. It's like in the movie Patton, there's a scene where Patton starts screaming at his staff, and after he's finished, his aide walks up to him and says, sir, sometimes they don't know whether you're serious or not. And Patton says, well, it's not important for them to know. It's important for me to know. Mm-hmm. And so the point is that if you're going to have a leader, you want a leader who knows what he's doing. And, it's like, a classic example of that is that you have to have people's respect, right? And so the classic example is Trump's last departure from the White House, where he wants this throng out at Joint Base Andrews saying goodbye to him. And he in the event, he got a couple hundred people out there, but he wanted to have a band and 21 gun salute. And he got a 21 gun salute, but
I'm surprised they pointed at the sky, frankly.
Right. Who gave two hoots about that? And it's one thing to have a band who's playing ruffles and flourishes for you because they respect you, and quite another because they have to.
Right.
And this is why Trump never got his parade with tanks going down the street, because he could never figure out how to get that done. And the military did not want to do it.
And that's a wrong message with a bad leader, because that's literally that's a loose cannon.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to let's see. I'm going to let Patrick Hollywood show his email address if he wants to. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up. So thank you, everyone, for being here today. It's been a good discussion, and we've got a good following going on YouTube.
This was good. I like it's poignant and timely. Good call.
So we'll see what else we're going to talk about next week. But for now, that's it. I am going to try to get Dr. Lee to speak to us on the wisdom path.
Excellent.
And I guess I should put the email address or the sign-up address. So let me do that. On YouTube for those of you.
And she's with the World Mental Health Coalition, and her book was The Shared Psychosis of Donald Trump and His Loyalists.
Right. And so if you're interested, if you're looking at us on YouTube and you want to know when that conversation might happen, or others, because we have others coming along, then please go to that link and register to join our sessions on Zoom. And so thank you, everyone, and we will see you another time.
Have a great one.
Tomorrow, by the way, Jordan, tomorrow we're going to do the minor arcana on tarot, and just a general discussion of what the four suits, maybe the 5 suits, mean. But I'm not sure I'm going to be very compos mentis because I do have a procedure at 3 p.m. tomorrow up in Baltimore. So I'm just going to be back from it when we start. So I may just turn the Zoom on and then leave you guys to it. We'll see. I mean, I'm getting I think it's a cortisone shot for my hip.
Oh, okay. Yeah. You might be a little in another world a little bit.
We'll see. I'm supposed to drive back from Baltimore. I did it once before in the fall and it was okay. But until I get a new hip, I've got to deal with this.
The pain, right. So yeah, and so between Nick and I think everybody, Raquel and Samantha, we'll thanks for the heads up.